In this Elden Ring video, I'm going to be showing you my Frenzied Acolyte build. This is a level 100 build that focuses on purely casting incantations to deal incredible damage. People have been asking me for two things, a pure incantation casting build and a madness build, and in this build, we combine both of those things because they work very, very well together. First of all, before I get into the build, let's talk a little bit about what Madness is. Madness is a new status effect that's never before been seen in any From Software title, and essentially it only works on human enemies, so this is going to be, any enemy that's basically the same size as you that looks humanoid, and it works on other players, so it's very effective in PvP situations. When you gain the Madness status effect, you basically lose 100 plus 15% of your max HP, and you lose 30 plus 10% of your max FP, and you're sort of like staggered for a second while this animation happens. The same is true when you apply this on enemies or other players. This is an extremely powerful effect, and what makes it different from other status effects, besides the fact that it only builds up on humans, is the fact that a lot of Madness abilities or spells also build up your Madness gauge, so you have to be careful how much you use Madness spells, or you will also gain the same status effect. One of the ways to mitigate that status buildup so that you can use Madness abilities or spells more effectively is by increasing your focus stat. This is attached to your mind attribute, but it's also on armor pieces, so when you're making a build revolving around Madness, if you intend to use that or these abilities and spells often, you want to make sure you have high focus so that you can cast more of these spells and abilities before you go mad. I also want to note that even though this build uses two spells that build up Madness on enemies and yourself when casting them, it isn't focused around Madness, meaning we're using those spells for the damage rather than the Madness effect, and this is predominantly a PvE build. You could use it in PvP effectively, I have not messed around with it, but because Madness is so effective in PvP, you could also use it there if you want. With that in mind, we're going to optimize this build to get the most damage out of these spells, not necessarily the most Madness. So let's talk about the two spells that we use in this build that inflict Madness, and these are the Flame of Frenzy and Frenzied Burst. The Flame of Frenzy is sort of a mid-ranged conal AoE that deals incredible fire damage and has very, very high stagger potential. If you do one charged cast of this spell and one regular cast, you can stagger the trolls in this game, which is pretty incredible. Usually it's two charged R2s. You don't even have to do that with this spell, and you can do it at range. So this is very good at staggering bosses, as well as very good at AoE situations and dealing incredible damage to larger type enemies. As I mentioned, you can hold down R1 to charge it up to increase the range that it casts, but you don't have to. Frenzied Burst is a single target spell that deals less damage than the Frenzied Flame. However, it has incredible range. If you thought Loretta's Great Bow had good range, this spell has incredible range, and you can hold down R1 to increase the damage it deals, and this is really good for picking off targets at long range. It has kind of a high casting cost at 24 FP, so you're not going to use it all the time, but if you really need to take something out without engaging it at, close range, this is the way to do it. And just like the Frenzied Flame, it deals fire damage as well. Those two spells not only allow us to stagger bosses, but also pick off enemies at very long distances in one shot, usually, maybe two shots in some cases if they're tough enemies. So this gives us incredible versatility when combined with our mid-range single-target spells that are a lot cheaper. If you want to play a pure caster, incantation caster, these two spells should be in your repertoire if they're not, because they are absolutely phenomenal. So talking about the equipment that I use for this build, out of all the builds I've made, this build has the most specific equipment, and you're going to need a lot of very specific pieces to get the most out of this build. So the seal that I use for this build is actually the Dragon Communion seal, although I use a few seals for this build, but the primary one you're going to be used for casting is the Dragon Communion seal. It has amazing scaling when you pump Arcane, and it also scales off Faith as well, even though to a lesser extent, and you're going to need some Faith to meet the requirements for these spells, so those are not wasted, and those also apply to your Incantation scaling, giving you very, very high damage. Beyond the scaling, though, the bonus to Dragon spells is not beneficial to this build because we don't use Dragon spells, although you could add them in here if you want. But we use the Frenzied Flame seal in our offhand, and the Gravelstone seal, and the Godslayer seal in our offhand, and we cycle these depending on the spells that we're going to be casting in order to get their increase to those types of spells that we're using. You don't have to cast the spells with those seals in order to gain the bonus, they simply need to be in your offhand. And a note here as well, if you would rather not cycle between these three seals, you could actually use the Jellyfish Shield here instead to boost all types of spells by 20%, just buffing yourself every 30 seconds to get that damage buff. But it also adds a lot of equip load, and it does make it harder to use Bloodhound Step, which we use on our weapon for this build, so there are some downsides to doing that. So essentially what we want to do here is we're going to be casting with Dragon Communion while we have the Frenzied Flame Seal in our offhand to cast our two Frenzy spells in order to boost their damage by 20%, which is phenomenal. So then you're going to cycle to the Godslayer Seal when you want to cast Black Flame, and you're going to cycle to the Gravelstone Seal when you want to cast Lightning Spear. It may sound like this is a lot of cycling, but the reality is that in most boss fights, a boss is weak to a certain type of damage, like lightning for instance, and you're just going to stay on the Gravelstone Seal and Lightning Spear for that fight, or maybe they're weak to fire and you're going to stay on the Frenzy spells, or maybe Black Flame's working really well and you're going to stay on the Godslayer Seal. You don't typically change these up very often because enemies in a general area are typically all weak to the same type of damage. So it's not something you need to change around a lot, so if it seems like it's a lot of managing, it really isn't as much as it seems. For my actual weapon here, I chose the Glaive with Occult Scaling in order to gain damage from all that arcane that we have, and I put Bloodhound Step on it in order to give you spacing. You want to get out of harm's way when enemies are aggressive to a safe spot where you can then swap back to your Dragon Communion Seal and start flinging spells again, and then swap back to your Glaive and start dancing away. The weapon you choose here is not specifically important to this build. The reason I chose the Glaive is that I find when I use Bloodhound Step, particularly if I'm trying to attack with it, because there are cases where enemies are going to be weaker to physical damage than fire or lightning, for instance, that when I use Bloodhound Step, I sometimes slide by bosses, or I slide just a little bit past them or to the side, and having a short-reaching weapon sometimes misses them. By having a longer-reaching weapon, even if I slide a little bit left or right of them and I'm not exactly ending up where I want to be, I can still connect with my strikes, and this is true of other long weapons as well. It doesn't just have to be the Glaive. So you can really choose whatever weapon you want here. The focus of this build is on the spell casting, as it's mostly a caster build, but that's what I went with for this build. When it comes to armor, I'm using the Silver Tier Mask to give me 8 arcane. We don't really do a lot of physical damage with this build, so with a Glaive, so reducing our attack power with that is not terrible. Getting that 8 arcane frees up a lot of other points for a lot of other attributes, so that's really, really good for this build. For my armor, I used Commoner's Garb, not only because it gives us 1 faith, which is fantastic, but also because it has very, very high focus. And as I mentioned before, having high focus is how you resist madness buildup, so that when you're using things like the Frenzied Flame, you don't make yourself mad and apply that, stats effect to yourself. The other 2 pieces I use for this are Noble's Gloves and Noble's Trousers, again for their high focus values that will help prevent you from, filling your madness bar completely and applying madness to yourself. You can use other armor pieces here that have good focus if you want, that give you more protection. But just keep in mind that, the less focus they have, the more careful you're going to have to be about madness buildup. I find that with this setup, I don't really have to worry about madness at all. I can basically cast madness spells at will, except in some cases. So it's not really an issue. But if you want more protection, you might have to sacrifice a little bit of focus. When it comes to my talismans, I use Godfrey Icon, Faithful's Canvas Talisman, Ritual Sword Talisman, and Fire Scorpion Charm. You can actually sub out Fire Scorpion Charm for Lightning Scorpion Charm if you're going into a boss fight where you're going to be chucking Lightning Spear a lot, or if you're fighting an area of the game where enemies are weak to lightning or they resist fire and you're going to be using Lightning Spear. So this one is changeable with the Lightning Scorpion Charm, periodically. Godfrey Icon is there to increase the damage of spells that we charge. The Frenzied Flame is chargeable, Frenzied Burst is chargeable, Black Flame is chargeable, Lightning Spear is chargeable. So all these spells are chargeable, so all of them will gain an increase to damage when using the charged version of them. Faithful's Canvas Talisman is there to increase the potency of your incantations by a little bit of percentage. It's not a lot here. We'll swap this out later for a better version of this. But in order to get the most possible damage, we have this one. And we also have Ritual Sword Talisman for the same reason. This boosts your overall damage by 10% when you're at full health. You're not going to be getting hit very much with this build because you're going to be sliding all over the place with Bloodhound Step in order to stay out of harm's way. So this will increase your spell damage by another 10%. And Fire Scorpion Charm is obviously there to boost your fire damage. Most of the spells you do deal fire damage here, with the exception of Lightning Spear, and I already mentioned when you might sub in the Lightning Scorpion Charm. So generally how this build plays is that you're just going to make your way around the landscape, attacking enemies with your spells at range, deducing which ones are doing the best damage, and then if you can't one-shot enemies with your spells, either charged or uncharged, depending on what the situation is, you're going to buff with Golden Vow to increase your damage further, just to make it so that you can one-shot the enemies. If you don't need to buff with Golden Vow to one-shot enemies with spells, then don't waste the FP. But otherwise, use this to make sure you can one-shot them if you're in areas where you need that. Flame Grant Me Strength is your extra buff there to increase your fire damage for your fire spells. Obviously, you're not going to use this if you're using Lightning Spear, but it's there for like boss fights or tough enemies when you need to get even more fire damage out to kill something very, very quickly. And don't forget while you're doing this that you're going to want to swap your seal around in your left hand in order to, get the one that benefits the spell type you're casting. For instance, if it's Black Flame, then you're going to want Godslayer Seal. So make sure you're using the right seal for the spell that you're casting. When it comes to stats for this build, I have 35 Vigor, 29 Mind, 10 Endurance, 18 Strength, 15 Dexterity, 9 Intelligence, 27 Faith, and 45 Arcane. Keep in mind that both Faith and Arcane are boosted by equipment pieces, Arcane by 8 points and Faith by 1 point, so those will actually be a little bit less than what is shown here. 35 Vigor is there to make sure that you don't die in one hit. You have very light armor with this build, so you want to make sure that you can at least survive to take a pot. You could go a little bit lower than this and go a little bit more Glass Cannon if you feel comfortable, but if not, you want to leave that there. Mind is at 29 for this build. Mind not only increases focus, which helps you resist madness, but it also gives you more FP to play around with spells. As a spellcaster, you need FP, and as you approach 150 with this build, you're probably going to want to increase this even higher because these spells cost a lot of FP, and you want to be able to fling them at will. 10 Endurance is there because we don't really need Equip Load at all for this build, and we need the points elsewhere. 18 Strength and 15 Dexterity are only there to meet the requirements for the glaive. These stats will vary depending on what weapon you're using, so if you're using something that's like 10 Strength, 10 Dexterity, you'll actually have a lot more points freed up here that you'll probably want to put in Faith and Mind in order to increase your damage more and to give yourself more FP to play with. We don't need Intelligence at all for this build, so that's at 9 because of my class. 27 Faith is needed not only to meet the requirements for some spells, but the Godslayer seal requires 27 Faith, so if you want to boost Black Flame by using that seal, even though it's not upgraded in your offhand, you're going to want to have 27 Faith minimally. You need 25 for Golden Vow anyway, so a couple extra points just to get that is good, and also boost your damage as well. When it comes to Arcane, this is obviously your primary stat for damage here. We stop at 45 because there is sort of a steep drop-off in terms of damage at this point forward, so you're actually going to want to continue to increase Faith to increase your damage, and when that hits about 45 or 50 or so, you probably want to start bringing these up together to further increase your damage. One last tip before I wrap up this video: if you're using the Flask of Wondrous Physique for a boss fight or some tough enemy, you're going to want to adjust either lightning or fire damage depending on what that enemy is weak to. So if they're weak to lightning, you're going to want to use Lightning Spear. You want that to be the lightning shrouding one, and if it's fire, you're going to want the fire one there. It's a no-brainer. Otherwise, you can either put Faith in there with it in order to increase your damage further with all spells, or you can put the Stone Barb Cracked here in order to increase your stagger damage. As I mentioned, the Frenzied Flame does incredible stagger damage, so just making that stagger even easier will give you knockdowns on bosses where then you can just unload into them with the Frenzied Flame. That wraps up our 100 level builds for Elden Ring. We're going to move on to 150. I might need an extra day to get up to 150 and start testing things. I'm not exactly sure yet, but stay tuned for those because we got a whole nother round coming.